Good morning, everybody. It's really a great pleasure for me to be moderating this session. And to nobody's surprise, this is a panel full of women as we are diving deeper into this issue of gender that has come up many times. We're running a little bit late, so we have until 2:15 for this session. And I already have to give the bad news to you that your lunch break has been cut by 30 minutes, but that's what you get when there's such an interesting discussion and conversation around the issues. This panel, we're going to look at key issues of wages, equality, non-discrimination, the gender pay gap, all of which are, of course, also at the core of the work of the ILO here in Egypt and globally. So I'm very happy that these issues are coming out. Just maybe before we dive deeper into this, let me introduce you to the speakers that we have, and we're going to start off with Mona, who is assistant lecturer at the University of Cairo and who is really mainly working on labor economics, and she has authored together with Professor Megadala, whom you all know extremely well, this very first interesting paper on trends in income and wage inequality in Egypt. Ladies, the floor is yours, and you have 20 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to present our paper on trends in income and wage inequality in Egypt throughout the period 1988 till 2023, authored by Dr. May Gadalla, Mariam Hagag, and myself. The presentation is structured into, divided into 4 main sections in addition to the introduction in section 1 and conclusion in section 4. It tackles wages in Egypt from 1988 to 2023, mainly covering wage distribution and trend and wage inequality. And the third section tackles income in Egypt from 2012 till 2023, covering income distribution trend, prevalence and diversification, and income inequality and its decomposition. So this paper aims at examining the evolution of income and wage distribution and the trend in Egypt. It assesses income diversification and the contribution of each income source to overall income inequality. The paper draws on data from all waves of the labor market panel survey spanning from 1988 till 2023 at the highly disaggregated level. The study also decomposes income inequality by income source to see the contribution of each income source to overall income inequality. So we started by wage distribution and the trend, and this figure shows the evolution of real median hourly wages from all jobs throughout the studies period. And as we can see here from the total category, wages witnessed 3 main drops throughout the period. The first in 1998 following the economic reform program, which witnessed a considerable shrink in public sector employment and the influx of labor supply in Egypt to be absorbed in the private sector. So this put high pressures on the labor market and on overall wage level. And the 2 other drops mainly occurred after the currency devaluation in late 2016, which can be inferred here from the decline in 2016 and 2018 and 2023. Wage trend by subgroups like gender and sector and education level shows similar trend as the overall trend. However, we can witness also that we can notice that some groups witness wage improvement during 2023, and those groups are mainly enjoying more favorable working condition, like those working in the public sector, women, and also people or workers with higher education level. Concerning wage disparities, we can see that wages disparities is more pronounced and could be observed when wages are increasing rather than when they are decreasing. And also we can see that wage disparities is more pronounced among women than among men. And this is can be seen from the distance, the high distance between the line trend over time between the two groups. Concerning the disparities in wage among different groups, so we can see also that women in general, starting from 2012, are receiving higher wages than men. This, however, should be interpreted with caution because, as we can see from previous literature, there's evidence of decline in the labor force participation among women in particular. So women usually exit the labor market when the working conditions are not favorable, unlike men. Also, we can see that wages in the public sector is consistently higher than the rest of sectors, like formal and informal private sector, especially starting from 2012. And this could be attributed to the implementation of the minimum wage policy in the public sector, which is actually enforced in this sector compared to the private sector, whether formal or informal. Wages also tends to move monotonically with education level. So it tends to increase generally with the increase in the level of education. This graph shows the growth rate of real median hourly wage on average between each subsequent 2 years of the survey. And it confirms the conclusion obtained from the first figure. And we can again stress on the fact that the major drops in real wages happened in 1989 and during 2018 and 2023. And also the increase in the real wages or the improvement in real wages typically happen among groups like women, like those working in the formal and the public sector, those working in high-skilled occupation, and those with higher education degree. This graph show the relative changes in median real hourly wage by wage decile. The right-hand side figure shows the overall evolution, and the left one is disaggregated by gender groups. For overall trend, and as you can see, between 20 and 18, almost all wage decile witnessed a major decline in real wage. However, the decline is more pronounced among those with higher wage compared to those with lower wages. However, in the second period between 18 and 23, we can see that the middle wage decile experienced the largest drop in terms of real wages. Disaggregating data by gender, we can see that between 12 and 18, both men and women witnessed a major decline, and the decline is again more pronounced among people in higher wage decile. But afterwards, between 18 and 23, we can see that women managed, especially those in the higher wage decile, managed to attain a net positive increase in real wages. We also analyzed the low wage share, and this is the share of workers earning below the minimum wage level. And we calculated this share by estimating or getting the real wage term, real minimum wage term, considering 2012 as the base year, and then transforming the monthly minimum wage level into hourly considering the typical working hours in the public sector, which is 36 hours per week. And as you can see, there's an increase in the share of workers earning below minimum wage level from 2012 till 2023. The percentage increased from 55% and reached 69% in 2023. And this increase was this share was particularly higher among men than among women, among informal and formal private sector worker compared to public sector worker, among those with low education, low skills, among early entrants to the labor market and rural if compared to urban workers. And again, while the share is particularly higher among vulnerable groups, but it's among men higher than among women because, as you know, that women is typically employed in the public sector. As for 2023, women employment in the public sector actually constitutes more than 60% of total women employment compared to a share of 26% for men. Considering the improvement, which groups witnessed actually an improvement in terms of the low wage share, we can see that women, the share improved for women in 2023 compared to 2018, as the share decreased from 64 to 58%, also improved among public sector workers, among workers with higher education level, and among high-skilled workers. Pertaining to wage inequality increased slightly over the period, especially starting from 1998. As measured by Gini coefficient, the increase was from 36.2 to 43.1 in 2023. Generally, some groups have a general a higher level in wage inequality compared to others. However, this is not consistent across all years because we have many developments between different years. So generally, we can say that older workers are more likely to encounter high wage inequality level. Also, those working in the formal private sector, those with high education level and high skill level, women, for example, and urban workers. However, we can see that the level of wage inequality is accelerating among particular groups, and those groups are the vulnerable one. And as you can see from the red arrows here, the wage inequality level is accelerating actually among early entrants to the labor market, among informal private sector workers, among low-skilled workers, also among women, rural, and those with less than basic education. I now will give the floor to Dr. May to continue the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. This part is gonna discuss the income in Egypt. Let me first start that the income that we analyze is income, a monthly income per capita. And the data actually covered the different income sources. It covered labor income, capital income, and transfers. For the labor income, we classified it to wages that comes from public sector, formal private, and informal private. As for the self-employed and employers, the earnings were classified into earnings coming from agricultural business and earnings coming from non-agriculture. As for the capital income, we combine the financial assets with the non-financial. And for the transfers, we distinguish between remittances, contributory pensions, and non-contributory transfers. Let me first start with the income distribution. What happened actually between 2012 and 2018, the whole distribution of income shifted to the left, which means it declined. What happened between 2018 and 2023, it slightly recovered, but still it didn't reach the initial levels of 2012. What we can see here, actually, on the left-hand side, there is a little bulge that shifted even more to the left, which indicates the increased share, the increased, I'm sorry, it's the cell phone, which indicates actually that the low income earners is increasing. When it comes to the wealth quintile, when we look at them at almost the first, fourth, and fifth quintiles, it's very clear that there is decline in the monthly income per capita, and only for the second and third quintile, there is a slight increase. When analyzing the relative change across the entire distribution by looking at the relative change in each decile between the successive years, it's clear again in 2018 the decline was very strong and even stronger in the first decile in the red circle. Looking at the distribution by gender on the right-hand side, both female and male-headed households experienced a sharp fall in income across all deciles in 2018, with the fall being sharpest among the poor, male and female. But for the female-headed households, it was even a little bit sharper. When it comes to 2018 compared to 2023, all male-headed households experience an increase in the monthly income per capita, even for the first decile, while women actually continue to suffer from a decline in the monthly income per capita. The second thing that we needed to study is the income source prevalence, the percentage of households receiving each income source. What happened actually between 2012 and 2023, there was a decline in the prevalence for the households receiving public wages. So it declined from 28 to 18 in 2023. At the same time, there was an increase in the percentage of households receiving income from household enterprises from 19 to 22. And there is an increase in the percentage of households receiving contributory pensions from 2020 to 29. On the same hand, it's necessary to notice that the percentage of households who receives actually assets or capital income declined by almost half.
Dr. May, you have 3 minutes remaining.
Looking at the shares of income in addition to the prevalence, we reached the conclusion that by gender here, we reached the conclusion that although female-headed households rely heavily on remittances and contributory pension, it's very clear that the share of contributory pensions among female-headed households increased from 26 to 42. On the other hand, the share of remittances declined from 15% to 7%. At the same time, the share of enterprises actually increased for both male and female-headed households, which actually coincide with the previous presentation regarding the increase of employers, self-employed and employers. When looking at the inequality measures for the income, the general conclusion is that there is somehow stability in the Gini coefficient and other measures, but when we look at the share of total income that the bottom 10% receive, it's very clear that it dropped by half between 2012 and 2023, that even the top bottom 10% receive even less than 0.5 of the total income. This slide actually, it discusses the income sources, the composition by income sources, and the relative contribution to inequality and to the total income share. Generally speaking, what we notice here, if it's a plus sign, then it means that it contributes to increasing inequality. If it's negative sign, it contributes to decrease the inequality. This is only mentioned here for the last year. And as you see, the public wages actually contribute to the increase in addition to formal private, while the informal private wages contribute to the decrease of inequality or this equalization. At the same time, the contribution to inequality actually changed between 2012 and 2023. In particular, as you see, the contribution of the assets. It increased from 16% to 22%. I'm coming to the conclusion, and in general, currency devaluation since late 2016 have been reflected negatively on wage and income distribution. The relative decline of median wages was highest among males and low-educated, low-skilled, and informal workers, and the decline is continuing in 2023. Wage inequality shows an increasing trend over time, and this increase is more pronounced among women, low-skilled, and informal workers. There is low income diversification among households in Egypt, as most households rely on one or two income sources. While male-headed households recovered slightly from the income drop in 2018, female-headed households are still facing decrease in the income. Wages are the most important income source in Egypt among all subgroups, yet their share are declining over time, especially public sector wages, which actually align with the shrinkage of the sector. The shares of remittances and capital income dropped in 2023, especially among female-headed households, while their dependency on contributory pensions increased. Income inequality shows a slight stability. However, the income share of the bottom 10% of the population dropped by half, reaching only 0.5% of the total income. Wages, especially public sector wages, are the key contributor to income inequality, and their contribution was the highest in 2018. Informal sector wages have the largest equalizing effect among the rest of the income sources. Thank you, and for more details, you can check the paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the two of you. We're now moving on to our second paper of this panel, authored by, I want to say it correctly, Shireen Al-Asawi, who is a teaching professor at Santa Clara University, focusing on labor and gender issues, poverty and inequality, as well as international trade, emphasizing especially on work in North Africa and the Middle East. And she has co-authored this paper with Vladimir Lasny, who is with us online from UNESCO in Beirut. Professor Shireen, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to present our work here today. And thank you to ERF and CAPMAS and all the hard work put into putting these surveys together. I'm going to be talking today about occupational segregation and the gender wage gap in Egypt. As we have seen in the previous presentations today, women have achieved gender parity in terms of education in both secondary and primary education. There has been unprecedented women's participation in political seats in the parliament, in government, in judicial roles, and so on. So there are several positive aspects. However, as we've seen today very clearly, women's labor force participation and employment are low and have been declining dramatically over the last several years. There are also significant gender pay gaps. The previous paper already touched on that. And as we'll see today, this is especially pronounced in the private sector. Of course, there are many explanations ranging from the decline of the public sector, discrimination by employers, as well, of course, as some supply side factors such as motherhood penalties, traditional social norms, and of course, the heavy unpaid care burden that women in Egypt have to bear. In fact, as we'll see in the presentation today, women have been increasingly concentrated in a very narrow set of so-called female-friendly occupations. And our study will examine exactly the extent of this occupational segregation over the long run and present results on some of the reasons behind it, whether we can explain them using characteristics of the workers or the bulk of that gap is in fact unexplained. I won't go too much into this, but this is basically the same statistics, the same information that was presented earlier about the decline of female participation over this period from 22% in 1998 to 18% in 2023. And of course, this is a very important point to keep in mind as kind of the backdrop behind all of the results that we have today. So with all of this decline in participation, there's a very small group of women who are actually in the labor market. And even for those, we will see that there is substantial occupational segregation. Now, we start by looking at the occupational distribution of workers. And looking first at the left-hand side of my slide, we see that over time, the structure of occupations has changed slightly. So in 1998 and 2006, skilled agricultural workers were the major jobs in the economy. And women made a minority of that, but a slightly bigger minority in 2006. By 2012, the structure had changed a little bit, and now we see rising shares for craft and related trades workers, and professional jobs as well. And this trend has continued, and now in 2018 and 2023, the biggest categories are the service and sales jobs, followed by the craft and related trade. So agriculture is declining a little bit. Still, it's a big employer, but not as it was in 98 and 2006. Now, as we can see, the red part of all of these occupations is relatively small. So overall, women make small groups within each of these occupations, but there are some sectors where there are a lot of women. So if we look on the right-hand side of the graph, we see that over time, more women are concentrating, in professional, clerical support, and technician and associate professional jobs. So it really varies by year. If we look at 2023 in particular, we see that women make up about 38% of the professional group, 37% of technicians, and about 36% of the clerical support. So these are the two or the three largest occupations for women in the most recent data. Of all the women employed and looking over time, and except for 2006, women have been concentrated in professional occupations. That is the red part of my graph over here. And this has continued in all years except 2006, when skilled agricultural workers among women were the largest group. In recent years, there has been slight declines in the share of professional women. In some years, it was technicians and associate professionals that were taking over. In other years, it was clerical support. But in general, these are the three largest groups for women in the labor market. Now, for men, the situation has changed a little bit over time as well. In the late 90s, the biggest categories were agriculture and craft and related trades. Today, agriculture is a much smaller share for men. Craft and related trades is almost the same, but there's a slight increase, particularly from 2018 to 2023 in plant and machine operators and assemblers. So I think this also matches with the result earlier that manufacturing has seen a slight increase over this period. Now, looking at women, and I hope you can read this graph, it was a bit hard to try to fit everything in a single graph. Women happen to be concentrated in a very, very narrow set of occupations. If we look at the 3-digit occupational classification, so a much finer level of occupational disaggregation, we see that between 50 to 80% of women over time are concentrated in 5 to 6 occupations, mostly as teachers, and especially primary school and pre-primary school teachers. So that is actually one of the biggest categories in almost all years. We also have a lot of women concentrated in sales as secretaries or other types of clerical support, and increasingly nursing and midwifery. But actually, it's just a 5% in the most recent data. So very, very narrow occupational segregation. These 5 or 6 occupations account for consistently 50 to 80% of all of the women workers in the labor market. Now, to try to quantify the exact amount of occupational segregation, sorry, this should be segregation, not disaggregation. We used a commonly used method of calculating the dissimilarity between men and women in the labor market, the Duncan index of dissimilarity. I won't go through it in detail, but basically it measures the degree to which women's occupational distribution is different by occupation from that in the whole distribution. So a value that's close to 0 implies a lot of integration. A value that's closer to 1 implies very high segregation. Now, the data allowed us to look over time by various levels of disaggregation, which is a very important aspect of the richness of the ELMPS data. Now, or a few important points here. So only the 1-digit, which is the broadest occupational classification, is comparable over time. It's the only one that's harmonized over time by the data set. And so if we look at the blue lines over time, we see that occupational segregation fell a little bit by 2006, increased, fell again, but then roughly it is around the same level it was at all the way back in 1988. So there's not much action by this broadest level of occupational disaggregation. However, if we look at the 2-digit or the 3-digit or higher, there does seem to be a lot more occupational segregation. And also, it has been rising to some extent, at least by the 2- and 3-digit in the last few years, from 2008 to 2023. And this result is not surprising given what we just saw about women being concentrated in a very small number of narrow occupations. We can also look at this dissimilarity index by education. And we see that women who are the highest educated with university and above education tend to have the lowest segregation, which is expected. This is typical in most countries around the world. And those with the highest degree of segregation are those with secondary or vocational education. So there's a lot more occupational difference for people with mid-levels of education. Interestingly, the illiterate and read and write, and those who can only read and write, also have a high degree of integration. Now, looking at the public versus the private sector, which is a very important difference in this analysis, we see that occupational segregation for the private sector has fallen over time, but then has increased again in 2012, 2018, falling slightly in the last 5 years. For the public sector, and interestingly, public segregation is actually higher than private. It has been roughly falling over time. Now, of course, it's important to keep in mind what's happening to male and female employment in the public sector at the same time. And as was mentioned earlier today, occupations or jobs in the public sector in general have been declining. And of course, women are much more affected by this since they made up almost 60% of all women were employed in the public sector in 98. And today it is just under 40%. So that is a major decline. And if we look more carefully at the types of jobs that women lost, I'm not sure if my pointer here is working. Most of those jobs are the high-paying professional technician jobs. So in the late 90s, for example, almost 90% of all professional women were in the public sector. Today, that's just under 70%. And the same thing happened with technicians and associate professionals and clerical support. So women are definitely having fewer opportunities in these highly coveted public sector occupations. Next, we look at the index of dissimilarity by formality status. And not unexpected, especially given the importance of public sector employment for women, we see that there's much more segregation for formal workers in Egypt. And this is true in all years and using both the 1 and the 4 digits. So regardless of the degree of disaggregation of the data. And then finally, we also look at age cohort. And here we see that the younger age cohorts face much higher degree of segregation than older women. So definitely something to think about in terms of opportunities. Perhaps these are also reasons for lower participation or higher degree of discouragement among women. Turning now to the female to male earnings ratio, so the gender wage gap. And again, we look at the public versus the private over time. And first, we look at the mean female to male earnings ratio. And for the private sector, interestingly, initially, women were facing or were getting paid higher wages on average than men, at least using the hourly wage. This has declined steadily to reach all-time lows in 2012 and 2018. Women's wages were about 73, 74% of those of men. On an hourly basis. There has been some improvement in the private sector between 2018 and 2023, but it still stands at just above 80% of men's wages. The public sector is a bit more equal, as is expected. However, it still did face this decline in the female to male earnings ratio between 2006 and 2018. The monthly figures are a little bit different, showing, again, similar trends. However, women continued to be at lower female to male earnings ratios starting from 1998. So it was never above the male ratio. And again, there is a difference between public and private. Both have seen an improvement, but the improvement for the public sector has been much more pronounced. Looking now at wages or wage gaps along the distribution, which is really an important part of this study, not just at the mean, but at the 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentile. We see a lot of difference within the private sector, but pretty much nothing really changing in the public sector. So focusing first on the private sector, we see that there are significant wage gaps, especially at the lower end of the distribution, but the gap has been declining. So that's at least good news. And in fact, for the highest groups, for the highest income groups, women are actually making almost 20% more than men in the 90th percentile and above. And this is even in the private sector. In the public sector, in 2023, both the median, the 75th, or actually the median 75th and 90th percentile women are actually making more than men in the public sector. So it's a trend that was already mentioned by the previous presentation as well. But in general, the wage gap is really a private sector issue, not much difference between the different groups along the distribution in the public sector.
You have 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you. I'm about to finish. Now, the last thing that we did was to try to look at explanations for these wage gaps. And well, actually, let me just present this very quickly. If we look at the mean monthly wage in the private sector and compare it to the share of women in employment in that sector, there does seem to be a slight negative relationship. So as the share of women in employment in the sector rises, the wages do tend to fall, though there are, of course, a lot of sectors with very, very few women. So that is something to keep in mind. Plus, of course, all the women that are not in the labor force to start with. So moving now to the regression analysis to try to disentangle the effect of endowments, characteristics of workers, such as education, experience, as well, of course, as occupation, and the returns to these endowments. And we look at that over the whole distribution rather than just at the mean using unconditional quantile regressions. Our results vary quite a lot between the private and the public sector. The red line, I know the writing is very small, so the red line represents the returns effect, the unexplained effect, essentially. The green line represents the impact of occupations, and the blue line represents the impact of other endowments other than occupation. So in pretty much all years, really, the occupation has a small effect early on the top part of the distribution. So the higher income women, there is some impact of occupation here on keeping the wage gap high. But in general, the big story is really the unexplained part. It's mostly a matter of returns to endowments rather than the endowments themselves. If anything, women's endowments in some years would actually serve to lower the gap, particularly in terms of their high educational achievement. So this is the situation in the private sector. In the public sector, things are a little bit different. And here we still do see that discrimination or the returns to endowments is a major part of the reason behind the gender wage gap. However, especially early on, occupation had more of an impact in 1988 and 98. And in 2023, we see actually that the impact of this returns to endowment has declined quite steeply for women at the top of the distribution, while the impact of endowments is actually serving, endowments other than occupation is serving to keep the gap in check. So the picture is very different depending on whether we are looking at the public or the private sector. Let me just take a very quick minute to summarize some of our main results. Occupational segregation is prevalent in the Egyptian labor market, with women concentrated in a handful of very narrow occupational categories. And this seems to have intensified over time. It's highest for those with secondary or vocational education, those who work in the private sector, who work formally, and those who are younger. The mean wage gap is large in the private sector and has been increasing over time. And we see that the wage gap is highest at the bottom of the distribution. Most of the gap in the private sector cannot be explained by observed characteristics, including occupation. The differences in returns to endowments account for almost all of the gap in all years. In the public sector, endowments other than occupation explain an increasing share of the gap at higher deciles in the last few years. Returns to endowments account for most of the difference along other points on the distribution in all years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all three of you for these very excellent papers. I think they beautifully also feed into each other, and we have a much clearer picture. We're now moving on to the discussant part, and I'm very happy that we have with us Dr. Shireen online to comment on the first paper. Dr. Shireen, the floor is yours.
Give me just 1 minute because I think you're seeing this subtitles and I don't know how to remove them. So if you don't worry about them, I can continue. Do you hear me?
Yes, it's moving. We can hear you. We see the slide. And the slide is moving.
And the subtitles?
And the subtitles are there as well.
Okay. Yeah, let's deal with them then. So good afternoon, everyone. And I would like in the beginning to say that I would have loved to be with you in person, but unfortunately other commitments have kept me away. But I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to contribute virtually and to engage with all of you in this important discussion. The discussion that I'm supposed to share or to contribute to is about the paper on, let me find the title, in the trends in income and wage inequality in Egypt. And most of the authors, if not all, are my young colleagues in Cairo University. This is the paper represents an ambitious and thorough effort to analyze income and wage inequality trends in Egypt over multiple decades. It is well structured, logically presented, and methodologically sound, making it a robust foundation for academic discussion and policy formulation. However, as with any comprehensive study, there are areas where clarity, analytical depth, and policy relevance can be enhanced, and I will structure my comments around the key aspects of the paper, offering or trying to offer constructive suggestions for improvement. So this is the first set of general comments. The paper leverages the unique longitudinal structure of the ELMPS dataset, making it highly relevant to Egypt's socio-economic challenges. Its integration of inequality measures like the Gini coefficient, the entropy indices, and income source decomposition demonstrates methodological rigor. However, the abstract and introduction could be refined to better articulate the paper's core findings and their implications. There are for instance, I would like the authors to contextualize the paper's contribution given the recent studies that were included in the upcoming handbook of the Egyptian economy on inequality. These studies reveal a puzzle. All measures of inequality, whether of outcomes or opportunities of inputs, they all show that inequality in Egypt is moderate and has remained almost stable, changing within a very narrow range, even when growth rates are positive, increasing, and poverty also is increasing. So the paper could acknowledge this paradox and highlight how inequality in wages and income are among the least explored dimensions of inequality in Egypt. By doing so, I think the paper can demonstrate its significant contribution to filling a gap and providing valuable insights into a crucial but under-researched dimension of inequality. And this rich data set can help us clarifying the puzzle. For the presentation, I can see that, I mean, this data set, it's very rich, and all authors are keen to inform us about the details of the data. Sometimes too many details in one graph and too many graphs in one, I mean, panels in one under one title. So maybe to ensure that all figures and tables have clear descriptive titles instead of saying evolution, growth rates. So let's have a kind of descriptive title to avoid help the reader following smoothly the paper. Another thing about the flow, and I will say mention one element, and then the presentation will be with the authors if they would like to consider all other suggestions, like the decomposition analysis. I saw it. This is a key contribution. However, it appears somewhat later in the paper. If wages are established as the primary driver of inequality in earlier sections, so I would like them to consider moving the decomposition section earlier in the paper, right after the descriptive trends, to deepen the analysis of wage inequality before moving to broader trends. There are other, I mean, things like the minimum wage discussion, where to put it, the poverty and inequality trends. But I will not go into this. And then I'll move to the data and methodology. Many of the footnotes actually should not be footnotes, because they explain the methodology, how the data were calculated. I mean, the variables were calculated, and I would suggest just to move all these footnotes into the data and methodology. So I mean, I have an idea before going into the details. Not every time we do an explanation, we mention it in this section and not in the data and methodology. Also, I know that the attrition and how to handle it, the refresher samples, Dr. Raghi Assad in the morning said things about this, and I'm assuming that there are other papers to deal with this, but again, the paper can refer to these papers, ensuring readers have access to the full methodological context while keeping this paper focused. The choice of many indicators to measure inequality, I didn't find any explanation of using all these measures. I know that they will tell us more complete picture of inequality, but it should be explicitly mentioned, the pros and cons, the limitations that they have, so they complement each other to tell us a more complete and comprehensive story. On the Egyptian economy, it's very informative, because it puts contextualizes the paper. It added Egypt's macroeconomic policies, the social protection programs. Although I found kind of link between what was said here and the remaining parts of the paper, like the inflation, the devaluation, the takaful and karama was taken into consideration, but I was not clear whether food subsidies, for instance, were taken into consideration. So if it's not the case, then this part could be easily removed from the paper. For the analysis, of course, it's very rich and detailed, but there are points where trends are described without sufficient interpretation. I know that many times when we're requested as authors to give interpretation to all the results, it's not easy, but this is something that deserves more attention. I have something on the policy implications, and I have heard Dr. Raghi Assad saying that it will be the responsibility of all the researcher community. Yes, of course, but again, we're hoping to find some explanation in this descriptive part of the work. I would recommend to briefly interpret the drivers of these trends and their implications for inequality and policy. The wage trends and income sources, the discussion is very insightful, but could go. Do I have still time?
You still have a minute and a half left.
Okay. Many of what I'm going to say is about giving explanation and tell us the implication of like here insufficient minimum wage adjustments and recommend the specific policy solutions. Sometimes I would say tell us about other countries and whether this trend is similar in peer countries or we're unique in this trend. This will be also very useful. I'm not going to this. In many instances in the paper, there is a space to tackle the issue of middle class vulnerabilities, but it's not very clear or explicit. And I think we need to have this issue of the middle class more focused on to enrich the paper analytical depth and emphasize the importance of policies targeting this income group, because usually all policies target only vulnerable and poor, but I think this middle class has become vulnerable and deserve more attention. This is for the minimum wage adjustment, again, referring to other countries. For the tracking the minimum wage gap, I saw how, we focused on the share of low wage, but I would like to see the gap between the minimum wage and the actual wage, and whether this gap is increasing or decreasing with time. And the suggestion again here is supported by what this could reveal. On the policy relevance, while the paper highlights important trends, it could do more to translate these findings into actionable policy recommendations. I know the opinion now of the group of researchers of this project, but again, highlights just the policy implications, not going into the details and not to tell us about the very genuine, the broad recommendations, but just what would this finding help me while considering the problem. At last, I need again, to thank my colleagues, the authors, for this excellent paper and the opportunity to engage with their important work. They have an excellent, the conclusion, this is the overall assessment I want to do this. So to maximize the impact, I would just suggest simplifying technical language and ensure accessibility for broader audiences. And when we use this technical language, maybe just a definition of what we were talking about, to strengthen the narrative by linking descriptive trends to analytical insights and policy implications, and to expand the discussion of structural drivers and comparative context, and to provide concrete, actionable policy recommendations. Maybe we in the coming round of research that will be conducted using this very rich data set, and I need really to commend the ERF dedication to making this rich data set publicly available, empowering a broad community of researchers in Egypt and beyond to explore and analyze and build on this work. And I wish this to be the case also with all other data sets that maybe we don't have easy access to or late access. Thank you very much to everyone, and I'm eager to listen to the interventions from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shireen, for these very detailed comments, and I think the authors will have the time to respond to those. But for now, let me give the floor to Mireya, who is the Senior Social Protection Specialist based here with the World Bank, who will be providing her comments on the second paper. Mireya, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just assumed a new position. In fact, I'm the program leader for human development based here in Cairo, but my professional affiliation is with social protection and labor economics. So let me just start by thanking the organizers and the authors for giving me the opportunity to comment on the paper. I'm going to approach this a little differently. I'm going to not necessarily talk about the technicalities of the paper, but I would like to expand on the findings of the paper and the policy implications. But I would like to start by saying, sorry, I think it's interfering, is it? No. Okay. By saying, I think this paper makes a really interesting and valuable contribution to the literature, and in particular to the discussion around female labor force participation, the drivers of it, and not. So I find it. Okay, all right. Thank you. So on the analysis side, I think the methodology that you've used allowed you to sort of do a pretty granular analysis, the quintile analysis, which I really appreciated. And then also the regression analysis, you were able to take into consideration quite a number of variables, which allowed, again, your ability to draw a number of really interesting and important conclusions. So 2 questions and suggestions. I wondered whether the analysis can be extended to a higher number of ISCO digits. So now you've done the analysis over ISCO 4. I understood that there isn't necessarily standardization or coding beyond that, but that the data is available. But I think this would be really interesting because this would provide, well, first of all, allow more granularity, but it will allow us to explore whether sort of the more promising occupational pathways for women, right? And I think that's really important to be able to identify the specific occupations. And then the second question and suggestion is, I wonder whether there could be a differentiation made in the analysis between self-employment and wage employment. I mean, there is informal and formal, but private sector. But I think it would be interesting to sort of disaggregate that further into wage employment and self-employment. And again, observe the differences, and again, identify the opportunities for women for self-employment, for the reasons that we all appreciate, because self-employment, as in the previous panel it was mentioned, self-employment in fact and indeed offers a lot more opportunities for women, given sort of the flexibility considerations as well. So let me then focus on the findings. I think it's very, very encouraging to read that, or to understand from the analysis that when women and men are managed to be hired in the same occupations, then the wage differentials are actually very, very small, which I find is, again, very encouraging, because this implies that there are high returns to endowments, in fact, right, to the supply side characteristics. And this has an important implication for policy making. And secondly, which I find very interesting and important, is that women who manage to work for the large employers who offer the higher wages, the higher bracket wages, tend to excel when they remain in the job. And they get higher returns than men, which again is a very, very important finding, I think, with a very important and interesting policy implication. Because that means if there are the right kinds of investments made to put women in the right occupational tracks, then those wage differentials tend to close. So again, as you said very rightly, and I just want to highlight it because it's important, the occupation and employer effects are driving these wages. No.
Well, actually, I said it was the unexpected.
Yes, yeah. Right. So then coming to the sort of policy implications, I wanted to highlight a few things. So clearly education is one. So at the secondary level, primary and secondary level. But then investments in counseling during school and after school, during that school to work transition, proves to be very, very beneficial, actually, in many countries. And going back to your sort of findings and the analysis, I believe there would be a lot of value, again, counseling young women into the right occupational tracks, and in particular the younger cohorts, again, given sort of the prominence of those wage differentials in the younger cohorts. And it's very important for young women then to have access to apprenticeship and internship programs. Again, work experience makes a difference, and it makes a big difference. It is important in terms of signaling. It's important in terms of connection to the labor market, to the employers. And it allows young women to make the right start and accumulate experience. And there, what we know and see from different countries is that it is important to have private sector linkages in the training and certification and these apprenticeship programs. Again, because these act as signals to the labor market, but also it allows the young women to make the right start in the right streams of occupational paths and with the right sort of wages as well, I think, if there's the right kind of partnership with the private sector. What is also important, I think one can say here, and again, it was mentioned in the last panel discussion as well, is employer incentives for hiring and retaining women tend to be very, very, very important, and they work in many countries. So in this case, again, drawing on your analysis and conclusion, if there were incentives in the form of tax credits or other in certain occupations, in certain sectors, it seems that there could be further gains made in sort of mainstreaming women into different occupational paths and then closing these wage differentials.
1 more minute, please.
So the analysis also made me think whether, again, it's not necessarily an extension of this study, but perhaps another study or another research paper is, to quantify the contributions to the economy, because there are right now wages lost in essence, right? So it would be interesting and important to quantify those wages lost, or sort of or sort of the mirror image, the revenues to be gained in terms of taxes. Of course, we're talking about formal employment here. If more women were to enter more productive and higher wage jobs. That's all from my part, but thank you. This was very inspiring for me. I congratulate you again, and thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to open the floor for questions. I'm sure there's a lot. We have 10 minutes, please. Microphone, please. Oh.
Hear me? Yes. Good morning, everyone. Hello, everyone. I am Rasha Ramadan, professor at Cairo University. First, let me thank Professor Rogi Asad and CAPMAS and ERF for this important source of data for all of us, even those who are not working on labor issues. I have 2 quick questions for the 2 papers. First, I would like to thank you for the papers, very interesting. I'm looking forward to read it. For the first paper, I don't know if I get the message correctly or not, but there was an improvement in women's wage. So is this true, the message I got it? And what is the main reason behind? Especially that in the second part of the presentation, you talk about wage inequality, especially among highly educated persons, highly income level, and women. So women observe improvement in their wage, and in the same time, still there is an increase in inequality, if I got it right or not. For the second paper, I'm really not surprised, but I would like to see what is the policy implication of the decomposition of wage inequality in 2023 in the public sector, especially the advantage of this decomposition, that we can have targeted policies based on the different income levels. So we can see in 2023 that for some groups it's the endowment effect, and for others it's a discrimination or unexplained effect. So how this can be translated into policy implications. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there another question in the room? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. This is Lina Nabaroy from UNICEF. My question is similar to Dr. Shireen's about the justifications. Like, there's a lot of interesting findings, specifically more on Dr. May's presentation. Like, she mentions the increase in contributory schemes for females, that female-headed households are having a decrease in income and decrease in remittances, but I'm not sure whether there were a specific justification or what drive these changes in these indicators. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, Mona Saeed, American University in Cairo. I echo what Rasha said and others about how useful those 2 papers will be. I expect, a multitude of more detailed by the same authors and others. based on them. And that's why my first question to Mai and Mona is, we know how difficult it is to work with wage data in terms of, the problem of underreporting, of, a lot of outliers. And I was just wondering, how did you deal with that in terms of the, your methodology to the actual wages that were used? Because you didn't show it in the presentation, but I had a quick look at the paper. It's always indicative to look at the monthly median wage. I didn't find that. I found only the hourly, but the monthly median income was around £1,000 in 2023. Is that correct? And I found that a bit very low. So I think it needs explanation, if I'm right. I mean, are we really using, a particular way that resulted in, in the methodology that resulted in this very low average figure for income? And it will be interesting to look at the monthly one. But I think you have shown that there has been real wage erosion over time, which is expected. Now, my other question is about how did you measure the, and you explained it very briefly, how did you measure the low wage line? Because, I know it's unfortunate we don't have official published figures on the poverty lines. Everybody's just assuming by projection that poverty has been worsening in Egypt. And, in the previous round, we had poverty lines from which we could calculate low wage lines. And I know you didn't have that, so I think you decided to go for the minimum wages. But then there is an intuitive problem here, because when you look at when you reported it for the public sector, for example, 46% of public sector workers are below the minimum wage. I mean, it shouldn't be the case, because the minimum wage is enforced in the public sector. So is this a problem of, underreporting? So I think there is an issue with using, or how did you calculate this minimum wage exactly, this low wage line? It's not very clear, and then we have this issue that maybe it doesn't make sense, or it's yielding results that don't make much sense, for example, in the public sector. My question to Shireen on I think you did, an excellent job looking at all possible, ways of looking at the index, Duncan's index of the similarity, and by looking at what's happening to occupational segregation as a whole. But I find that there was a little bit of a line that greater occupational segregation is always a bad thing, by gender. But really, it's, you have the data, and it would be good to have some, even at the descriptive level, showing, those sectors where women are concentrated, what are their average wages, So the issue is when women get crowded in the low-waged occupation, both vertically and horizontally. And that's really what you try to study after that. So you looked at wages on their own, you looked at occupations on their own, and then you put the occupations, I think, as dummies in your regression. Was that how you looked at it? Just it wasn't further than that, just the occupational dummies?
And the proportion of women in the occupation, and it did show a negative relationship.
Yeah, I noticed that, and it's, it's interesting because it's against international evidence that usually women, when the feminized sectors are usually more hospitable to women, for example, education or something like that. So it needs looking at. But no, I'm just wondering about, how we decided that occupation, that the percentage of the gender gap due to occupational segregation is less than, pure wage discrimination. I think this is just the first step, and we need to be careful because, you really need to do some kind of decomposition, like the Oaxaca decomposition that will then distinguish between how much of the gap is due to, occupations, returns to the occupation, how much is, so, just using the dummies doesn't give, a full picture.
That's what we did. That's what we did. Maybe it just didn't come out clearly on the graph, but that's exactly what we did.
Right,
yes.
yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these questions. Shireen, I'll give you the floor immediately.
Okay. Thank you very much for your discussion of our paper. You provided very useful policy implications and suggestions for expanding the paper, and we'll definitely take all of them into consideration. To Rasha's question about the policy implications, I think what really comes out clearly is the returns to endowments are really the issue. So there's clearly a lot of discrimination going on. There are lots of things that can be done to try to reduce that. Obviously, there are societal norms that will take a very long time to change. But I think something that you mentioned earlier about providing a higher or more experience for women. In fact, in our regressions, experience comes out as the main human capital variable that is significant. Everything else is not, which is interesting, that women really lag behind in terms of experience. And so giving women opportunities to do internships, to work longer times, to have more connections to the labor market, to get these experiences will hopefully raise their value in the eyes of employers, right? So the problem really is that employers do not seem to value women, or perhaps women might be too expensive to hire. We know about all of the laws and regulations that might make women slightly more expensive to hire. So it's really a long-term policy recommendation to improve the view of women in the labor market. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers. It's not education anymore. I mean, I don't think we've already surpassed men in terms of education, and so that's not really going to help in the future, but there are other things that need to be done. Wage subsidies, more opportunities for internships, for experience on the job. Perhaps more formal jobs might actually encourage women to be in the labor market and then to show their value. But again, all of these are very difficult things to happen, and they will take a long time. Thank you.
Dr. May?
Thank you. I would like first to thank Dr. Shireen Shawabi for her comments. I will respond for Dr. Rasha's comment, the first one, about the improvement in women wage. Yes, there is improvement in women's wage, but this couldn't be interpreted as a real improvement, especially in light of the evidence from papers during this session that there is a decrease in the labor force participation among women. So when they find that the working conditions are not favorable, they usually exit the labor market. So the remaining becoming in the public sector where working condition is favorable. So this could explain why there is an improvement in women's wage compared to men. For Dr. Mona's question related to how the low wage share is calculated, it's based on the minimum wage level, minimum real wage level, not the poverty rate. So we got the minimum wage level and considered 2012 as the base year where the minimum wage level was 700 Egyptian pound, and we get the real values for the minimum wage for the rest of the years, and this is monthly, and we transformed this monthly real minimum wage into hourly minimum wage, considering the normal a number of working hours prevailing in the public sector, which is 35 hours per week. So we have now a minimum hourly real minimum wage across all years, and we get the share of workers in each round of the survey earning below this minimum real wage level hourly.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Shireen Shawabi for her valuable comments, and most of the comments actually encourage us to have another paper. So thank you, Dr. Shireen, for your comments. I have only one comment, and I'm taking the opportunity to discuss this very clearly for all the researchers, that the data have several weights. So you have to consider the objective of your analysis, if you're using cross-sectional analysis, or if you're using panel data. So if you're using panel data, you have to use the panel weights. And the panel weights were computed by Dr. Roge and Dr. Carolyn, and it put into consideration the attrition. So this is very important to mention. If you're going to use the cross-sectional, you're going to use different weight for this, and all these weights are included in the data set. This is my first comment. My second comment related to what happened to the female-headed households. And as mentioned in the presentation, what happened, the female-headed households continued to experience a decline in the income, and at the same time, their share of remittances, the share of remittances to the total income declined. And the remittances actually in Egypt declined throughout the previous years. And their share of pensions to the total income increased among the female-headed households. So putting this together, so their reliance on remittances declined, and the reliance on pensions increased. And it seems to be that the pensions didn't cope with the devaluation that happened in the recent years. So that would be one of the recommendations, actually, and one of the comments by Dr. Shireen about the recommendation. The recommendations actually are included in the policy brief. So if, inshallah, it will be published, if you see the policy brief, there will be a recommendation regarding this and regarding the female-headed households and what happened to them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, ladies. This was really excellent. I feel we would love to continue discussing here. Let me close by saying that just very recently, the ILO published a policy brief on the link between care work, women's care work duties, and labor force participation rates, which are really the main barriers holding women back. And let me also share with you that here in Egypt, women do 9 times the amount of care work as men do. And with that, I wish you all a very nice lunch and bon appétit. Thank you.